The first mistake I made was signing a document I barely understood because I trusted the person who placed it in front of me. Looking back, I can still remember that ordinary Tuesday morning. With surprising clarity, Vincent had spread several pages across our kitchen table while I finished my coffee before work. He spoke confidently about a new investment opportunity and explained that a few signatures were needed to move the process forward. According to him, the project could help us buy a larger home within a few years and create the kind of financial security we had always talked about. At the time, I did not see any reason to question him. Trust is a beautiful thing when it is supported by honesty, but it can become dangerous when it replaces curiosity. Many people assume that questioning someone they love is a sign of doubt or disloyalty. In reality, healthy relationships are strong enough to survive honest questions. Unfortunately, that was a lesson I had not learned yet. My name is Hannah, and I was 30 years old when the life I believed in began to unravel. For most of my childhood and early adulthood, my mother, Diana, had been the most important person in my life. She raised me alone after my father passed away when I was 8 years old, and although we never had a great deal of money, she somehow managed to provide everything I needed. More importantly, she gave me a sense of stability. Whenever something went wrong, I knew she would be there to help me find a solution. For many years, I believed nothing could ever damage our relationship. Then I met Vincent. The first time I saw him was at a charity event organized by a local business group. He was charming without appearing arrogant and intelligent, without making other people feel inferior. Unlike some successful people who enjoy being the center of attention, Vincent preferred listening to others. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered small details, and had a way of making people feel important. By the end of the evening, I found myself looking for excuses to continue our conversation. Within a few months, we were inseparable. When I introduced him to Diana, I expected her to be thrilled. At first, she seemed genuinely pleased that I had found someone who made me happy. She welcomed him into her home, included him in family dinners, and treated him with warmth and respect. If someone had told me then that the two most important people in my life would eventually become the source of constant conflict, I would never have believed it. The change happened slowly enough that I barely noticed it at first. As Diana spent more time with Vincent, she began asking questions about his past. None of them seemed particularly unusual on their own. She wanted to know why he had moved between several cities over the years, why he rarely mentioned old friends, and why there were so few photographs from his earlier life. I considered those questions unimportant, because everyone has experiences they prefer not to revisit. Some memories are painful, and some chapters of life are simply left behind. That explanation was good enough for me. It was not good enough for Diana. The more she learned about Vincent, the more concerned she seemed to become. Whenever she raised another question, I immediately defended him. Whenever I defended him, she became frustrated because she felt I was refusing to listen. What started as occasional disagreements gradually developed into serious arguments that left both of us upset. By the time Vincent and I got married, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Family dinners no longer felt comfortable. Telephone calls often ended awkwardly. Visits that once brought us closer together now seemed to create new misunderstandings. The situation hurt me deeply because I loved them both, yet I constantly felt trapped between them. One evening, several months after our wedding, I found myself discussing the latest argument with Vincent while we sat together in our living room. Rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a peaceful background that contrasted sharply with my frustration. I expected him to react defensively, but instead, He listened patiently and allowed me to finish speaking before offering his opinion. He told me that he understood why I felt caught in the middle, and he admitted that Diana's behaviors sometimes made him uncomfortable. Then he said something that seemed reasonable enough at the time, but later became impossible to forget. He wondered whether my mother was struggling to accept that I no longer depended on her the way I once had. The comment sounded thoughtful rather than manipulative, which is probably why it stayed with me. Over the following weeks, similar observations appeared in our conversations. Vincent never directly criticized Diana, but he often suggested that she had difficulty accepting change. He questioned whether she truly respected my ability to make my own decisions and wondered why she seemed unwilling to trust my judgment. The more I heard those ideas, the more convincing they became. Manipulation is not always obvious. Sometimes it does not arrive in the form of demands or threats. Instead, it appears as a series of small suggestions that gradually influence the way someone interprets events. A person may believe they are reaching their own conclusions without realizing that someone else carefully guided them toward those conclusions. Without noticing it, I began viewing many of Diana's actions through Vincent's perspective. When she expressed concern, I interpreted it as control. When she asked questions, I interpreted them as criticism. When she offered advice, I assumed she was interfering. As a result, the distance between us grew larger with every passing month. Around the same time, Vincent became increasingly excited about an investment project that promised impressive financial returns. He described it as a rare opportunity involving property development outside town and spoke about it with such confidence that I found it difficult not to become enthusiastic as well. He painted a vivid picture of the future, describing the larger house we could buy, the financial freedom we could enjoy, and the security we could build together. The dream sounded realistic, because he made it sound realistic. Whenever I mentioned the investment to Diana, however, her reaction immediately changed. She wanted to know who was managing the project, where the company was registered, and why I had not personally reviewed every detail. Instead of appreciating her concern, I became irritated because her questions felt like another attack on my marriage. One afternoon, our disagreement became so intense that she left my house in tears. The memory stayed with me long after she was gone. I had never seen my mother cry because of something I said, and although guilt followed me for days afterward, Vincent always seemed to have a reassuring explanation ready. He gently reminded me that adulthood sometimes requires difficult boundaries and suggested that Diana feared losing her place in my life. Because I trusted him, I accepted that explanation. Several weeks later, Diana called unexpectedly and asked me to meet her for lunch. The moment I heard her voice, I sensed something was different. The frustration that usually filled our conversations had disappeared and been replaced by something far more troubling. She sounded frightened. We met at a small cafe near the river on a gray afternoon. When I arrived, I immediately noticed a thick folder resting beside her coffee cup. She looked exhausted, as though she had not slept properly for days. And there was a seriousness in her expression that made me uncomfortable. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, she pushed the folder toward me and asked a question that instantly made my stomach tighten. Had I already signed documents connected to Vincent's investment project? I responded defensively and reminded her that my marriage was not her responsibility. The hurt that appeared in her eyes was immediate, and even now I regret the way I spoke to her. Sometimes the people who care about us most become the easiest targets for our frustration because we assume they will always forgive us. Diana remained silent for several moments before finally opening the folder. Inside were photographs documents, and notes collected over many months. Every photograph showed Vincent, but something about them felt wrong almost immediately. In one image, he appeared to be signing paperwork under a different name. In another, he stood beside a woman wearing what looked unmistakably like an engagement ring. My confusion quickly turned into shock. Then Diana revealed the truth she had been trying to tell me for months. She had hired a private investigator. What the investigator discovered was disturbing enough, but the most frightening detail came at the very end of the report. According to the evidence he collected, the man I knew as Vincent had been using different identities for years, and the name Vincent was not the first one he had used. It was not even the second. It was the third. Before I share the rest of the story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. For several seconds, I could not take my eyes off the photographs spread across the cafe table. The sounds of conversations around me faded into the background. As my attention remained fixed on the images in front of me, each photograph seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the more I looked at them, the harder it became to dismiss my mother's concerns as paranoia or jealousy. One picture showed Vincent standing beside a woman I had never seen before. She was smiling, and the engagement ring on her finger suggested a future that clearly did not include me. Another image appeared to show him signing documents under a different name. There were also copies of records, notes from the investigator, and timelines that connected places, dates, and identities in ways I struggled to understand. Diana remained silent while I examined everything. She seemed to know that I needed time. Eventually, I looked up and asked the question that had been forming in my mind since she opened the folder. Why didn't you tell me all of this sooner? The sadness in her eyes immediately deepened. She explained that she had tried many times. Every conversation eventually turned into an argument because I refused to believe anything negative about Vincent. According to her, the more she pushed, the further I moved away from her. She feared that presenting incomplete information too early would only make the situation worse. As painful as it was to admit she was right, I remembered every argument, every warning, every opportunity I had ignored. Sometimes people reject information not because it lacks evidence, but because accepting it would force them to change a belief they desperately want to keep. Looking back, I realized I had spent months protecting my image of Vincent instead of examining the facts in front of me. Diana pointed toward one section of the report and explained that the investigator had spent months tracking Vincent's previous business activities. The process had been difficult because many records appeared incomplete, and several former associates refused to discuss him. However, one pattern appeared repeatedly. Vincent would enter a new city. He would build relationships. He would gain trust. Then money would become involved. Not every situation ended the same way, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. The woman wearing the engagement ring had invested a large amount of money into a project connected to him. Shortly before their relationship ended, another woman mentioned in the report had reportedly lost savings through a business arrangement that never produced the promised returns. No criminal convictions appeared in the records. No clear proof of fraud existed. Yet the pattern remained troubling. My stomach tightened as I remembered the documents I had signed only weeks earlier. For the first time, I considered the possibility that Diana had not been trying to interfere in my marriage at all. She had been trying to protect me. The realization filled me with guilt. The image of her leaving my house in tears suddenly returned to my mind. At the time, I believed I was defending my husband. Now I wondered whether I had been helping him isolate me from the only person asking difficult questions. The thought stayed with me long after we left the cafe. That evening, I returned home carrying emotions I could barely understand. Fear mixed with doubt, doubt mixed with guilt, guilt mixed with anger. Most of that anger was directed at myself. When I entered the house, Vincent greeted me with his usual warm smile. He asked about my day and offered to prepare dinner. Everything about his behavior seemed normal, which somehow made the situation even more disturbing. I found myself studying him in a way I never had before. For years, I had looked at him through the eyes of a wife in love. Now I was looking at him through the eyes of someone searching for the truth. During dinner, I casually mentioned this investment project and asked whether there were any risks involved. The question appeared simple, but his reaction immediately caught my attention. For the briefest moment, his expression changed. The smile remained, yet something behind it seemed less certain. Then he recovered. He explained that every investment involved risk, but assured me that this opportunity was different. According to him, experienced professionals were involved, and the chances of failure were extremely small. As he spoke, another realization slowly formed in my mind. He was not answering my question. He was reassuring my emotions. There is an important difference between those two things. Honest answers provide information, while manipulation often provides comfort. The goal is not to explain the truth, but to prevent further questions. Once I noticed that pattern, I began seeing it in many of our previous conversations. Later that night, while Vincent slept beside me, I remained awake, replaying memories from the last 2 years. The more I thought about them, the more uncomfortable details emerged. He rarely spoke about old friends. He avoided disconcerting forms of relationships. He never introduced me to anyone from his earlier life. Most importantly, whenever Diana raised concerns, he always seemed prepared with an explanation that made her appear unreasonable. For the first time, I wondered whether that had been intentional. The following afternoon, my phone rang while I was working. The call came from my bank. At first, I assumed it was a routine matter, but the conversation quickly became alarming. The representative informed me that a substantial transfer request had been submitted through an investment account connected to recently signed authorization documents. My heart began racing. I explained that I had never opened such an account. The representative politely informed me that the paperwork contained my signature. The moment the call ended, everything became clear. The documents Vincent had asked me to sign were already being used. This was no longer a future plan. My savings were actively being transferred. Panic pushed aside every remaining doubt. I left work immediately and drove home. The house was empty when I arrived, and Vincent's car was nowhere in sight. For the first time since our marriage began, I entered his office without hesitation. I searched drawers, cabinets, shelves, and storage boxes, determined to find answers before he returned. Most of what I found appeared ordinary. Then I noticed a hidden compartment behind a row of files. Inside were 2 passports. Both contained Vincent's photograph. Neither contained the name Vincent. My hands trembled as I examined them. Beneath the passport sat a thick envelope. When I opened it, a photograph slipped onto the desk. The woman in the picture was not the fiancée from Diana's report. She was someone else entirely, and judging by the engagement ring on her finger, Vincent had already found his next victim. For several moments, I simply stared at the photograph lying on Vincent's desk. The woman looked happy. Her hand rested comfortably on his arm, and the engagement ring on her finger caught the sunlight as though it had been placed there to celebrate a future they were building together. What made the image truly disturbing was not the ring itself, but the date printed in the corner of the photograph. It had been taken less than 2 months earlier. I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath me. The hidden identities had already shaken my confidence. The suspicious investment project had created fear, but this photograph destroyed the final excuse I had been holding on to, a man who was genuinely trying to rebuild his life after past mistakes would not secretly become engaged to another woman while married to me. As I searched through the remaining contents of the envelope, the situation became even worse. There were emails discussing investment opportunities, financial documents connected to several accounts, and contact details belonging to people I had never heard of before. One folder contained information about the project. Vincent wanted me to join. When I saw the numbers, my blood ran cold. The transfer request involved nearly all of my savings. For months, Vincent had spoken about our future with such confidence that I never questioned his intentions. He described security, opportunity, and freedom while carefully avoiding details that might have encouraged closer examination. Looking back, I realized that trust had become the foundation of his strategy. The more confidence I placed in him, the less likely I was to ask questions. That realization hurt more than any document I found. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Vincent had returned home. Instead of hiding the evidence, I gathered everything and carried it into the living room. By the time he entered the house, the passports, photographs, financial records, and investment documents were spread across the table. His reaction told me everything. The confidence that normally defined him disappeared almost instantly. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I picked up the photograph of the woman wearing the engagement ring and placed it directly in front of him. I asked who she was. Vincent lowered his eyes. That simple reaction answered more questions than any explanation could have. Eventually, he admitted that the woman believed they were planning a future together. According to him, she had invested money into a business project and expected their relationship to become serious. He insisted that he never intended to marry her and claimed that the situation had become more complicated than he originally expected. The explanation made me feel physically ill. He was describing another person's life as though it were a business arrangement. There was no guilt in his words, only concern about being exposed. In that moment, I finally understood what my mother had seen long before I did. Vincent did not build relationships. He built opportunities. Every connection seemed designed to create trust, and every trust eventually became useful to him. The former fiancé in Diana's report, the missing money, the false identities, the hidden investment, the woman in the photograph. Everything formed part of the same pattern. People deserve second chances when they make mistakes. However, repeated deception is not a mistake. It is a choice. The difference between those two things became painfully clear as I listened to Vincent defend behavior that had already harmed multiple people. Earlier that evening, I had called Diana and asked her to come over. When she entered the house and saw the documents spread across the table, she immediately understood what had happened. For a moment, I could not even look at her. The guilt was overwhelming. I remembered every argument, every warning, every time I accused her of interfering in my marriage. Most painfully of all, I remembered the afternoon she left my house in tears while I defended a man who was quietly placing my future at risk. Some heartbreak comes from betrayal. Other heartbreak comes from realizing that someone who loved you was right all along. I apologized to her through tears. The words felt small compared to the damage I had caused, but Diana simply held my hand and listened. A mother's love is often stronger than pride, stronger than anger, and sometimes even stronger than disappointment. The conversation with Vincent continued late into the night. He apologized repeatedly. He promised to change. He claimed that his feelings for me had always been genuine. Part of me wanted to believe him because ending a marriage means letting go of an entire future. It means accepting that the life you imagined may never exist. People do not only lose a partner during divorce, they lose routines, plans, dreams, and the comforting belief that everything will work out. Yet some truths cannot be ignored once they become visible. Trust had been broken beyond repair. No promise could restore it. No apology could erase what had happened. Just before midnight, I told Vincent our marriage was over. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I looked around the room and suddenly realized how many memories had been built on half-truths. The photographs on the walls, the vacations we had taken, and the plans we had made for the future no longer felt the same. I was not only losing a husband, I was losing the version of my life that I believed was real. By sunrise, Vincent was gone. The months that followed were difficult, but they were also honest. There were lawyers, paperwork, and painful conversations. Some days felt impossible. Others brought small signs of healing. Through it all, Diana remained beside me, and little by little, our relationship began to recover. Nearly a year later, we returned to the same cafe where she had first shown me the investigator's folder. This time, there were no accusations, no secrets, and no tension sitting between us. We shared coffee by the window while watching people walk along the river outside. A few weeks earlier, I had received a letter from the woman in the photograph. She explained that she had learned the truth before investing the rest of her savings and wanted to thank me for warning her. Reading her words filled me with sadness for everything Vincent had done, but it also brought a sense of peace. The cycle had finally been broken. As I sat across from Diana that afternoon, I remembered the day she left my house crying because I refused to listen. Of all the mistakes I made, that was the one I regretted most. Some people enter your life with beautiful promises while quietly taking pieces of it away. Others risk losing your trust because they refuse to stop protecting you. For a long time, I believed my mother was the villain in my story. The truth was much harder to accept. She was the hero I spent years fighting against. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And tell us in the comments, who was the real villain in this story?